the worst pandemics in history, will open with the traveler explaining their gift or curse of stepping into different centuries. Will linger on their first encounter with the idea of sickness, not as a simple illness, but as a shadow that can stretch across continents. Will then travel to the plague of Athens, 430 BC, not yet diving into its numbers or brutality in a harsh way, but exploring it through the senses, the streets, and quiet moments of humanity. From there, we'll start moving toward the Antonine Plague, 165 AD, K, enclosed apart with the feeling that each era has its own heartbeat before silence. If you're ready, I can begin the full 4,000-word part 1 right now in one flowing piece. Do you want me to start writing it in a single, uninterrupted block, as we've been doing for your other bedtime series? Vocadis, Continuo, ChatGPTDs. Alright, let's begin. I have walked through centuries the way others walk through gardens. The difference is that in my garden, the flowers are not all blooming. Some are made of ash, some are made of whispers, and some carry a scent you wish you could forget. Time has no locks for me. A door can open in the middle of a quiet night, and I will step into an age where the air itself feels heavier. Carrying the weight of a world that has stopped breathing normally, I never truly chose where to go. Time seems to choose for me, and too often it chooses moments where the invisible is more dangerous than the sharpest blade. People think of war as the greatest destroyer of lives, but I've seen something far more patient, far less visible. Take even more a silence that begins in a single body and grows until it can silence cities. Pandemics, the first time. It's the first time I learned the difference between a sickness and a pandemic. I was standing on a hill overlooking Athens in 430 BC. The sky was summer blue, almost innocent, but the air below was tense. The city was still strong in its walls, but something inside was breaking. Remember walking through the stone gates, feeling the temperature change, not because of the weather, but because the human heart has its own climate, and here it was humid with fear. It began, they told me, in Piraeus, the port. Ships had arrived, as they always did, bringing goods, news, and unknowingly, a seed of something unseen. The markets were quieter. People still moved, but their eyes darted to each other as if glances could give away secrets. I walked through streets where the smell of olives and bread had been replaced by something sourer. The sharpness of fever sweat, the faint tank of decay carried on the breeze before it found a resting place. They didn't know what it was, still thought it was the wrath of the gods, others the work of enemies. No one understood how it moved, only that it spread. In homes where one cough had been heard, within days there would be silence. Not peace, silence. The kind that comes when the living are too weak to speak and the dead are too many to bury quickly. I saw physicians trying to help, their hands bare, their robes stained, their faces worn not only from the heat, but from the helplessness of treating something they couldn't name. I stayed long enough to see how quickly the human spirit can change shape. In the first days, there was care neighbors bringing water, mothers staying at their children's sides even as their own skin flushed with fever. But as the days lengthened, fear began to peel away the softer parts of people. Doors stayed closed. Those who could run, ran. And those who stayed sometimes did so not out of courage, but because their legs had already weakened. I could hear prayers whispered to Apollo, to Asclepius, to anyone who might be listening. But the air answered with more coughing, more groans. That was the plague of Athens, okay? They say it lasted for years, returning in waves. I didn't stay for all of it. Time pulled me away as easily as wind pulls a leaf from a tree. One moment, I was walking past the Parthenon, the marble glowing in the sunset while the city below dimmed with sickness. The next, I was standing on a Roman road, centuries later, under a colder sky. The year was 165 AD, though here, time was counted differently, in emperors and seasons of war. Rome's power stretched far, but power has no armor against what rides on the breath of men. I was in the middle of the Antonine Plague. It had followed soldiers home from campaigns in the East, men who had fought battles, seen blood spilled under the sun, now returned to their families, carrying an enemy they couldn't see and couldn't fight. It began with fevers and chills, and then the skin erupted in sores, red at first, then darkening, then sometimes opening to reveal what no one wanted to see. The smell of sickness was heavier here, mixed with the damp wool of winter cloaks and the smoke from hearth fires. I wandered through a marketplace where half the stalls were empty. A woman was selling garlic and honey, swearing they would keep the sickness away. A man nearby was selling amulets engraved with protective words. People bought them because hope, even if it's carved in metal and costs more than bread, feels like a shield when you have nothing else. I saw soldiers being buried in shallow graves, far from the marble of honor, because there were too many to bury with ceremony. The streets of Rome didn't echo with the same confident voices they once had. Instead, I heard the muted sound of shuffling feet, of people keeping their distance without even knowing why. They didn't have the language of quarantine yet, but the instinct was there. Could feel it, that strange rhythm that pandemics have. First, disbelief, then fear, then a resigned kind of living, where people continue with their days knowing the shadow is still moving among them. And yet, even in this, there were moments of light. I saw a young girl bring soup to her neighbor every evening, placing it by the door and walking away before she could be thanked. Saw a soldier, pale and coughing, wrap his own cloak around a child who was shivering. I saw laughter once in a bakery where the bread had burned because the baker had fallen asleep. It wasn't loud, but it was there. Those moments are why I never fully close my heart when I walk into these years. The sickness may cover the world like frost, but frost never kills the sun. It only hides it for a while. Still, frost can linger. The Antonine Plague stayed for nearly 2 decades. Some said it took the lives of emperors. Others whispered it had weakened Rome itself, not with the battles lost, but with the empty chairs left in every home. When time finally pulled me away again, I left Rome behind, not with the relief of escape, but with the weight of knowing the pattern I had begun to see. Centuries apart, different names, different cities, but the same invisible thread. Arrival without warning, spreading without mercy, leaving behind silence where voices used to be. The air shimmered, as it always does when I move through time, and I found myself on a wooden dock in the 14th century. The smell of salt water was thick, but so was something else, something bitter, something that clung to the back of the throat before you could name it. I knew where I was heading before I even asked. This was the beginning of something the world would remember for centuries, the Black Death. The dock was busy in a way that felt unnatural, a kind of movement born from urgency rather than routine. Sailors unloaded crates with quick, jerking motions, their eyes scanning the horizon as if the sea itself might spit out another threat. Behind them, the narrow streets twisted between wooden houses, their windows shuttered even in daylight. I could hear the gulls overhead, but their cries felt out of place, as though the city itself had fallen into a kind of hush that nature hadn't agreed to keep. The year was 1347, and though no one yet called it by its later name, the Black Death had arrived. It traveled in the fur of rats, in the blood of fleas, in the touch of hands that didn't know they were already marked. It didn't roar into the city, seeped the way water does through cracks in stone, finding paths no one had thought to guard. I walked through a marketplace where the scent of fish mixed with the pungent sting of vinegar, the latter sprinkled on every surface by desperate merchants who believed it might kill what they couldn't see. People avoided touching coins directly. They dropped them into bowls, then waited for the other to retrieve them after a pause. But the caution was thin, and fear traveled faster than any preventative measure they could imagine. At first, signs were small: a fever, aches in the limbs, a fatigue that felt like the body itself was made of sand. Then came the swellings, the buboes, blackened and tender, rising like small mountains under the skin of the neck, armpits, and groin. Some covered them with scarves. Others simply stayed indoors until they could no longer rise from there. Bedding, the smell of burning herbs drifted from many houses, thick enough to sting the eyes. People believed the smoke could cleanse the air, but the air itself felt heavy with something far older than smoke. I remember passing a church where the bell tolled, not at the usual times for prayer, but at irregular intervals, each one marking another death. The bell's voice was deep, but after a while, it became part of the background, like the creak of ships or the crash of waves. It was the kind of sound that the human mind eventually tries to ignore for its own survival. And yet, here too, light found its way through the cracks. I saw a young nurse reading aloud from a small book to a patient who was barely conscious, her voice steady even when she knew he couldn't answer. I saw neighbors leaving baskets of bread and apples on doorsteps without knocking. I saw musicians playing on street corners, their hats on the ground to collect coins, not for themselves, but for the families who had lost their main provider to the sickness. It struck me again, the same pattern I had seen in Athens, in Rome, in the medieval ports. The invisible enemy arrives. Fear and uncertainty follow. The world narrows to the space between breaths, and yet, even in that narrowness, the human heart finds ways to stretch. Time began to shift again. I felt it in my bones before I saw it. In the air, that soft pull, as if the present were a tide and I was caught in its undertow. I wondered where I would land next, and whether I would be stepping into another century's tragedy or a moment of quiet recovery. My feet touched the ground, and I heard the low hum of machines, the sound of television screens, the glow of electric light at every corner. It was 2020. It was 2020. And for the first time in all my travels, I stepped into a pandemic that I remembered, living through in my own original thread of time. The streets were not silent in the way medieval towns had been here. The silence had a mechanical quality, as though the world had been placed on pause. Cars sat parked for weeks in the same position. The air, usually full of chatter from cafes and open windows, carried, instead, the muffled sound of television, news drifting from behind closed doors. I walked down a main street in a city that could have been anywhere, the storefronts locked, handwritten notes taped to glass, closed until further notice. Stay safe. See you soon. There was something fragile about those messages, as if the ink itself was a promise the writers weren't entirely sure they could keep. People wore masks, their eyes the only visible part of their faces. The masks came in all forms: plain, medical, patterned with flowers, decorated with slogans. A new kind of unspoken language developed in those eyes. A lift of the brow meant hello. A long blink meant thank you. Even the distance between two people in line at the store became a kind of grammar. Okay? A way of speaking respect without words. The virus moved invisibly, riding in breath and touch, the way so many of its ancestors had. But now there was science to name it, diagrams to show how it traveled, updates that pulsed across screens in real time. In some ways, that knowledge was a comfort. In others, it was a weight, the daily numbers rising like an unending tide, charts and graphs replacing the bells I had heard tolling in centuries past. Inside hospitals. The scene was not so different from 1918, though the machines had changed. Beeping monitors replaced the constant need for a nurse's ear to the chest. Ventilators hissed with mechanical rhythm. But the exhaustion in the faces of the staff was the same. The deep grooves of sleepless nights and decisions no one should have to make. I stood in a corner of one ward and watched as a nurse adjusted the mask of a patient whose eyes were closed, her hand lingering for a moment on his shoulder as if willing him to feel her presence through the plastic and fabric. Outside, people found new ways to be together. Video calls replaced family dinners. Neighbors leaned out of windows to sing to each other. Musicians played from balconies, the notes floating down empty streets like a reminder that not everything had been taken. There were moments of stillness that carried both beauty and sorrow. The sky over cities clearing of smog, the quiet of parks where animals wandered without fear. It's this sudden awareness of how loud the world had been before, but there was also loneliness, a deep kind that no conversation through a screen could fully erase. People missed the warmth of a hand on theirs, the comfort of a crowded room where laughter rolled like a tide. And underneath it all was uncertainty. How long, how much, how many? And that 2020 was no different from Athens or Rome or the plague, ports of the Middle Ages. The questions were the same. Even if the language had changed, I stayed longer in this year than I usually do in my travels. Perhaps because it was my own. Perhaps because I wanted to see the shape of the story from the inside. And what I noticed most was not the fear, though it was there, but the resilience in the small acts, the food left on doorsteps, the sewing of masks by hand, the calls made just to hear another voice. These things, I realized, were the threads that wove the human heart back together after it had been frayed. One evening, stood at the edge of a quiet river that cut through the city. The lights from the buildings reflected in the water, long and wavering. I thought about all the pandemics I had walked through, all the centuries where life had been halted by something unseen, and I realized that in every age, the most important part of the story was never the sickness itself. It was what people did in its shadow. The sicknesses changed, the fever of Athens, sores of Rome, the black swellings of the medieval ports, the blue lips of influenza, the masked faces of the modern world. But the responses carried the same echoes. Fear, yes. Loss, yes. But also the stubborn will to keep going, to find one another, even when the rules of survival said to stay apart. As the days lengthened into warmer weather, I could feel time shifting again, the way it always does when it's ready to send me elsewhere. I didn't know where I would go, perhaps forward, perhaps back, but I knew what I would carry with me, not the numbers, not the names, but the memory of those who, in every century, chose to keep the thread of connection alive. The river whispered against the stones, and for a moment, I closed my eyes and let the sound fill me. It didn't matter if I was in 430 BC or 2020. Water would always find its way forward. And so, it seemed, would we? When I opened my eyes, the air shimmered. My feet lifted from the ground without moving. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I could hear the echo of a bell, a cough, a song, a voice saying, "Stay safe." And then the world dissolved into light, carrying me toward the next story. When the light around me cleared, I found myself on a narrow street where the air was thick and the sunlight felt dimmed as though filtered through dust. The sound was strange, not silent, not busy, but muffled, like a city breathing through cloth. I smelled incense before I saw it, smoke curling from brass censers held by robed priests who walked slowly down the street, swinging the smoke in wide arcs, as if to push away something the eye could not see. The year was 541, and I was standing in Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire in the time of the plague of Justinian. The city was immense, a tapestry of marble columns, domed churches, bustling markets, or at least it had been. Now, even in the shadow of the great Hagia Sophia, the streets were half empty. The markets were still open, but goods were left untouched longer than usual. the air around the stalls holding more whispers than conversation. I walked toward the docks, drawn by the low groan of ships being unloaded. Grain from Egypt had arrived, but along with it, something smaller, hidden in the fur of rats that scurried along the ropes. No one suspected the true carriers. Some said the plague had come as divine punishment. Others blamed foreign enemies. And still others spoke of bad air rising from the swamps. I had heard these theories before, in other centuries, in other cities. They were echoes of the same human need to give form to the formless. It began here, too, with fever. Then came the swellings, painful lumps in the groin, armpits, and neck, the same dark markers I had seen in the Black Death centuries later. I knew the story before it unfolded, but living inside it is always different from knowing it. The city's great cisterns still glittered with water. Its walls still stood firm. Its markets still displayed figs and olives, yet none of these could defend against what moved in the bloodstream. I remember seeing the Emperor Justinian himself, or rather, the way people spoke about him. He had fallen ill but survived a rarity, and this survival became a kind of talisman in people's minds, proof that perhaps they too might escape. But hope was thin, fraying at the edges. Each day the death carts rolled past. They said the dead were so many that the city ran out of places to bury them. Graves were dug hastily, and when space ran out, bodies were placed in towers and covered with quicklime to try to contain the smell in the quieter corners of the city. I saw something else, the same pattern that always appeared. A woman kneeling by the bedside of her neighbor, pressing a cloth dipped in vinegar to his forehead. Young boy carrying bread to the monastery, not for the monks, but for the sick lying in their care. The plague may have stripped away the grandeur of the empire, but in its shadow, the smaller, quieter forms of humanity seemed to shine brighter. Time didn't keep me there long. I felt the pull again, the shimmer in the air that told me another page of history was ready to open. When I stepped through, I found myself on the edge of a river, the water moving sluggishly under a hazy sun. The year was somewhere in the early 1800s, and the world was about to learn the name of a new fear: cholera. It began in the villages along the Ganges in India, where the water itself carried the sickness. I walked through a settlement where children played barefoot at the water's edge, unaware that the same river that gave them life also carried death in invisible form. The disease struck fast, cramps twisting the body, vomiting, diarrhea, so sudden and severe it left the skin cold and blue. Death could come within hours. The first outbreaks stayed local, but soon the sickness moved, with trade carried along rivers and roads onto ships that crossed oceans. I saw it leap from Calcutta to ports in Southeast Asia, then to the crowded streets of London and Paris. In those cities, fear took on a new edge, the realization that something so small could cross the globe faster than armies, faster than politics, faster than even news could travel. In London, I watched as Dr. John Snow, a physician with a stubborn gaze, mapped cases of cholera on the streets of Soho. I followed him to the pump on Broad Street, watched as he examined it, suspected it, and finally convinced officials to remove its handle. The cases dropped soon after, a quiet victory that marked the beginning of understanding waterborne disease. But before that understanding spread, cholera took many. The poor were hit hardest, crammed into small rooms with shared water sources, the luxury of clean wells far beyond their reach. Yet even in these cramped quarters, I saw mothers cradling sick children, neighbors boiling water for each other, men carrying the weak to the hospital on their backs. The same thread, always, from cholera's shadow, time pulled me again. This time into a quieter, more sterile place. The walls were white, the smell sharp and chemical. I could hear the hum of refrigeration units and the soft beeping of machines. The year was the late 20th century, and I was in the midst of the AIDS epidemic. Here, the fear was different. The disease moved slowly, often invisibly at first, hiding in the body for years before showing its face. It did not arrive with the sudden, devastating waves of plague or cholera, but when it came, it stayed. I walked through hospital wards where young men lay thin and pale, their hands held by friends and partners who had learned to be family to one another when the world looked away. The air was heavy with grief, but also with defiance. Activists marched in the streets, demanding research, demanding treatment, demanding that the world see them. Quilts were sewn, each square a memorial to a name, a face, a life. In the middle of the fear, there was love, fierce, visible, unashamed. As I stood in that ward, I thought about all the centuries I had walked through, all the sicknesses I had seen. Some had burned bright and fast, others smoldered for decades, but in every one the core of the story was the same. People finding each other in the dark. The shimmer came again, and I knew part 2 of my journey wasn't yet done. I was being pulled forward once more, and the next place I landed was in a warm, crowded marketplace under a blazing sun, a place where another invisible threat had begun to rise. The marketplace was in West Africa, the air rich with the scent of spices, grilled meat, and the earthiness of freshly cut fruit. Women in bright headscarves laughed together as they haggled. Children darted between stalls, and men carried baskets of goods balanced on their heads. It looked, at first, like life at its most ordinary and joyful. But as I walked deeper, I began to notice the murmurs, the glances, the way some stalls had fewer customers than they should. It was the early 21st century, and the first whispers of Ebola had begun to circle. It didn't travel like influenza or cholera. It was slower to appear, but far deadlier when it did. A sickness that filled people with dread simply at the mention of its name. Fever, weakness, body aches came first, symptoms shared with many illnesses here. But then the bleeding began, from places blood should not flow so freely. The disease consumed the body quickly, leaving little time for hope or intervention. I followed a health worker, dressed head to toe in a protective suit that made them look more like an astronaut than a healer. The suit made movement awkward, but it was the only thing between them and the sickness. They entered a small house where a woman sat by the bedside of her husband. She didn't wear gloves or a mask. She simply held his hand, brushing his forehead, whispering in their shared language. She knew the risk, but she stayed. In villages where the sickness appeared, entire communities changed overnight. Traditions were altered. Funerals, which had always been moments of closeness and shared grief, now had to be distanced, bodies handled only by those in protective gear. I watched a grandmother stand a few meters away from her grandson's grave, unable to touch the earth, her tears falling into her hands instead. The outbreak was met with fear, yes, but also with courage. Doctors Without Borders, local volunteers, international teams, they came into these hot zones knowing the danger, driven by the stubborn belief that even a few lives saved were worth everything. I saw the joy on a mother's face when her daughter, one of the lucky ones to recover, walked out of the isolation ward to applause. These were the moments that proved pandemics were not only about loss, they were also about the will to reclaim life. Time shifted again, as it always does. When my feet touched ground, I was in a crowded airport terminal somewhere in Asia, early in the new millennium. Masks were everywhere, and large screens displayed warnings about a new illness, SARS. It was a coronavirus, they said, and though it did not reach the global scale of what would come years later, it brought cities to a standstill. I wandered through empty streets in Hong Kong, the neon signs still glowing, but with far fewer faces below them. Elevators were cleaned constantly, temperatures taken at every doorway. The lessons learned here about containment, about contact tracing, about masks would echo in the decades to follow. From SARS, I was pulled to another chapter, H1N1 in 2009, the so-called swine flu. This one moved fast, carried by air, travel, touching nearly every country in months. Its symptoms were familiar, like a seasonal flu, but it had a way of striking the young and healthy, which unsettled people deeply. I visited hospitals where nurses shook their heads, saying it felt like déjà vu from stories of 1918. And yet, vaccines came quickly, an advantage no one had in those older pandemics. It was a reminder that knowledge was a kind of armor, imperfect, but better than facing the invisible unarmed. I thought about the centuries I had walked through in these two parts of my journey. From the fevered streets of Athens to the masked faces of 2020, from rivers carrying cholera to the blood-soaked blankets of Ebola wards. The enemies had changed names, but the shape of the story remained. An arrival, a spreading, a moment where life pauses, sometimes for years. And then, slowly, the movement forward again. The common thread was not the sickness, but the people in its shadow. Those who stayed at bedsides, who carried water, who cooked, for neighbors, who sewed quilts, who banged pots on balconies in defiance of fear. These were the acts that would outlive the pathogens themselves. As I stood at the edge of another time shift, I realized something else. Pandemics have always been both destroyers and teachers. They strip away comfort, but they reveal truths we might not see otherwise about how we live, how we connect, how we care for one another when the world feels dangerous. The shimmer came. It's that soft, pulling light that meant time was ready to move me again. I closed my eyes and stepped into it, knowing that part 3 would take me further still into other pandemics, other lessons, and perhaps into a moment when the sickness had passed and the air was finally clear again. And maybe, if time was kind, I would end in a place where the sound was not of coughing or bells or hurried footsteps, but of something I'd heard too rarely in these travels: unbroken laughter. The light settled around me gently this time, as if it knew I was weary from the weight of so many centuries. My feet touched ground on a warm afternoon. I found myself in a city I recognized, not because I had been here before, but because it carried a feeling I knew well. The quiet after fear has loosened its grip. It was a year beyond the worst of a pandemic. The streets were open, the cafes spilling laughter back into the air, the markets full again. People stood close without thinking about it, touched without hesitation. I walked among them like someone wandering through a dream, knowing how fragile such scenes can be. But this was not the end of my travels, only a resting place along the way. The shimmer came again, and I was pulled back much further than I expected, into the 16th century. I stood on the deck of a ship cutting across the Atlantic, its sails catching a restless wind. Below deck, in the dim, crowded quarters, I could hear coughing, a raw, tearing sound. The men here were part of expeditions to the New World, but they carried more than maps and ambitions. They carried smallpox. When the ships reached shore, the disease spread faster than any ship could sail. Indigenous communities who had never encountered the virus fell ill in devastating numbers. Villages emptied, traditions broke under the weight of loss. I walked through a settlement where fires burned low, not for cooking, but to keep away the chill of fever. The people here had no word for this sickness, but they knew its shape: blisters, high heat, weakness, death. I saw a healer sitting by the fire, grinding herbs she knew would not cure, but might ease the pain. She sang as she worked, not to the sickness, but to the spirit of the one she was tending. Her voice rose and fell like the wind through the trees. And for a moment, I thought perhaps that was the truest medicine in the world: the refusal to let someone leave without song. Smallpox would go on to change the balance of entire continents. And yet, centuries later, it would also become the first disease humanity would eradicate through vaccination. I remember the joy in 1980, standing in a WHO office as the declaration was signed. Smallpox is dead. Outside, life carried on as if nothing had happened, but I knew, and the people in that room knew, that it was a victory, won over centuries. Built on knowledge, bought with too many lives. From smallpox, time pulled me to South America in the late 19th century during a yellow fever outbreak. The air was thick with heat and the hum of mosquitoes, the real carriers, though not everyone believed it yet. Streets that had been alive with music were now quiet. I walked past, shuddered. Windows where families waited for signs of fever to appear or fade. The sickness began with chills and pain, but the later stages brought jaundice, turning skin and eyes to the color of old gold. Some survived, many did not. I met a doctor here, a man who carried both exhaustion and determination in his posture. He spoke of the need to drain standing water to fight the mosquitoes, but funding and trust were in short supply. I left him with his notebook open, his pen scratching down observations he hoped someone, someday, would use to end the cycle. And they would. Decades later, with better understanding and organized campaigns, yellow fever would no longer haunt these streets the same way. The shimmer came again, and I landed in a more recent time. The early 21st century, during the MERS outbreak in the Middle East. It was another coronavirus, spreading mostly in hospitals, carried by close contact, sometimes linked to camels. The fear here was sharp but contained, the world watching closely, aware now in ways it hadn't been before. SARS or H1N1. I walked through hospital corridors where the smell of disinfectant was strong, where nurses adjusted their masks with tired hands, where each case was treated as both a patient and a warning. And then, as if time wanted to bring me full circle, found myself in a place I could not place on any map, a kind of quiet between centuries. Around me stood all the faces I had seen, the Athenian mother with her fevered child, the Roman soldier in his worn cloak, the merchant from the plague port, the nurse from 1918, the masked stranger from 2020. They stood in a wide circle, each holding a small flame cupped in their hands. No one spoke. They didn't need to. I understood. This was the thread I had been following through every century. Not the sickness, not the fear, but the light that people carried for each other when the world dimmed. Was never the same shape, never the same size, but it was always there. As the circle of light grew, I felt the pull of time loosening. Perhaps my journey was ending, or perhaps it was simply pausing. I had no control over when I would be sent again, but I knew I would go because pandemics are not only the history of the past, they are the future waiting to be written. I closed my eyes, listening for the sounds of life, laughter in a reopened cafe, the hush of a prayer whispered over a sickbed, the rustle of pages in a scientist's notebook. When I opened them again, I was standing under a wide open sky, the air clean, the light warm. For now, there was no cough, no bell, no mask, only the sound of wind through leaves, and for the first time in many centuries of walking through the worst pandemics in history, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I could rest here a while. I sat down beneath a tree whose roots looked older than any city I had visited. The bark was rough under my hand, the ground warm from the sun. I could feel the weight of all the centuries I had walked pressing against me, not as a burden, but as a reminder. Each time I had stepped into another year, another crisis, I had carried something forward, not in my pockets, but in my memory. Faces, voices, moments too small for the history books, but too important to lose. The pandemics themselves would be remembered in numbers. How many years they lasted, how many lives they took, how far they spread. But those numbers would never tell the whole truth. They wouldn't show the way a soldier's hands trembled when he held a child, knowing it might be the last time. They wouldn't hold the sound of a nurse reading to someone who could barely hear her. They wouldn't capture the smell of bread left on a doorstep, or the way the air in a city changes when the first signs of recovery arrive. I thought of the many ways people had tried to fight the unseen: smoke, herbs, prayers, maps, masks, vaccines. Some had worked, some had not, but all of them came from the same place: the desire to protect each other, to pull one another through the darkness. That desire had survived every pandemic I'd seen. It had adapted, like the pathogens themselves, but it had never died. The wind moved through the branches above me, carrying with it a chorus of centuries. I could almost hear the layers of voices, the cries of ancient markets, the chants of processions, the murmurs of patients in crowded wards, the applause when someone recovered against the odds. They blended into one another until they became something softer, something like a lullaby. I closed my eyes. For a moment, I imagined what it would be like if time stopped pulling me into the hardest chapters. If, instead, I could walk into years, where the air was always safe to breathe, where streets stayed open, where people's faces were never hidden unless by choice. I knew that world didn't exist yet. Maybe it never would. But I also knew that humanity was always moving toward it, even if the steps were uneven, even if the path doubled back on itself sometimes. When I opened my eyes again, the horizon had changed. It wasn't a city or a village this time, but a long, quiet shoreline. Tide was low, the sand damp under my boots. In the distance, I saw small shapes, not people, but candles, hundreds of them, each resting in a glass jar to protect them from the wind. I walked among them slowly, realizing that each one had a name etched into the glass. Some names were from Athens, some from Rome, some from centuries I hadn't visited yet. I understood then that my journey wasn't about visiting pandemics to witness suffering. It was about carrying forward the memory of those who had lived through them, so they would never be reduced to a line in a ledger. The candles weren't only for the dead, they were also for the living, sizzling, for those who had stood in the middle of the storm and kept going. I reached the last candle and found no name on it. It's only a mirror, small and circular, set into the jar. When I looked into it, I didn't see my own face. I saw the faces of everyone who had ever stood by someone else in their hour of need. And then, slowly, the candle inside the jar burned brighter, and the mirror reflected only light. The tide began to rise, and the water touched the bases of the jars, but the flames did not go out. They swayed, bending with the wind, but they stayed lit. I stood there until the horizon blurred, till the water covered the sand, till I could no longer tell where the sea ended and the sky began. When I finally turned away, I knew my time. Here it was over. Another shift would come, another place, another lesson. But I also knew that no matter where I landed, I would bring these flames with me, not to keep for myself, but to pass on. Because pandemics end, what the light people make for one another does not. As I stepped into the shimmer, the last thing I heard was the sound I had wished for since the beginning of my journey: unbroken laughter, rolling in from somewhere just beyond sight. I arrived on a winter morning that smelled faintly of coal and damp wool, the kind of morning when the breath of every passerby turns briefly to cloud and vanishes. The station clocks were black-rimmed and punctual, iron rails gleaming like threads drawn tight across a continent. It was 1889. The rails were singing with speed, a new kind of speed that stitched cities together, not with caravans and sails, but with steam and schedules. When a world learns to move faster, its shadows learn too. The Russian flu did not announce itself with banners or proclamations. It simply took a seat on the same trains as everyone else. I watched travelers touch the same brass handles, lean on the same wooden benches, sip from the same porcelain cups, unknowing co-authors of a story already writing itself across timetables. A cough at one stop, a fever by the next dusk. Whole offices thinned, then whole neighborhoods. The newspapers counted days and cases, but inside homes, the counting went differently. Who was strong enough to get up? Who had managed some broth? Whose forehead cooled in the night? I traced the spreading line on a crumpled map, not with ink, but with footsteps. Berlin to Paris. Paris to London, each city a page in a book that will be read by every family, whether they wished to or not. I learned something there among the whistling engines and watchful eyes. Speed is a gift that asks a price. The faster we connect, the more carefully we must hold one another. I saw kindness adjust itself to the era. Notes slid under boarding house doors, offering to shop for the ill soup kettles left on back steps. And in the evening, the soft tap on a window pane that meant, I'm here if you need. No one needed to be told how to be gentle. They simply remembered. Time folded once, like a letter creased by a familiar hand and opened in a classroom whose windows were fogged by the breath of many children. A map of the world hung crookedly, its edges curling. A jar of chalk rested, like a small white snowdrift beside the slate. It was the mid-20th century, in a town that smelled of warm paper, K's sharpened pencils, and the metal temps of radiators. The bell rang for recess, but one desk remained empty, the chair pushed in too neatly, as if obedience could stand in for presence. Polio had come to this town the way a rumor comes quietly at first, then escaping the control of those who thought silence might protect them. I followed a mother down the hospital corridor, past doors where the air hummed with an unfamiliar mechanical breathing. Iron lungs lined the ward like solemn guardians, the bodies inside them moving only with the machine's steady rhythm. Mother slipped her fingers under a curved metal edge, just enough to touch her child's hand. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the whole room became a held breath. I stayed until summer turned its pages. In the heat, I watched neighbors keep their children home from the pool, watched churches open basements to serve as respite rooms with fans and lemonade, watched a young doctor with a notched tie and a furrowed brow speak softly about trials. In hope, the names of Salk and Sabin would, in time, move from white-coated corridors to living rooms, spoken with the kind of gratitude that makes a person stand taller when they say it. And then, one afternoon, stood on the street where a nurse carried a tray of sugar cubes dotted with a miracle too small to see. Children stuck out their tongues like conspirators in a sweet plot. Parents exhaled for the first time in years. Hope doesn't always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it tastes like candy and melts into safety. From there, the air changed, not in temperature, but in tempo. I was in Hong Kong in 1968, a city whose nights were written in neon and whose days moved with a quick, measured grace. The markets were a language of their own, baskets of lychees like rubies, piles of greens so fresh the water still clung to them, fish that looked as if they had only just decided to stop swimming. Beneath that brightness, a flu began to lay its careful pattern, the Hong Kong flu, successor to 1957's Asian flu, fitting itself along bus routes and ferry decks, office corridors, and apartment stairwells. It wasn't the darkest shadow I had ever walked through, but it was long, touching millions, ending more lives than most wars could count without adding drums. I rode a tram past rows of balconies, and in each square frame of life, I saw the same small acts, a cloth laid on a forehead, a hand at a window to signal, I'm okay, an anti-stirring kanji like an ancient mantra for healing. What struck me most then wasn't the illness, but the choreography of care. Schools adjusted, workplaces staggered shifts, temples lit candles until the air shimmered. Scientists wrote lines of code in the language of viruses and vaccines, turning fear into work into answers. The future would not remember every name, but it would live in the shelter of their labor. And when the city's fever broke and laughter spilled back into the streets, it came not like a flood, but like rain beginning to fall on a long, thirsty garden. Here a chuckle at a noodle stall, there a giggle from a balcony. Thin streams of conversation turning corners and flowing together until the sidewalks gleamed with it. I have always loved the moment after a sickness passes. People count what remains, not by numbers, but by sounds. That's when I know I can move on. Time pressed its fingertip between my shoulder blades, and I stepped into a humid evening where the orchestra of insects was so loud it felt like part of the weather. Again, Brazil, 2016. The air held notes of mango skin and hot stone, hung invisible and heavy, as if the sky itself had to hold it carefully. Outbreaks do not need to be apocalypses to be devastating. They can break hearts by changing futures before they happen. Walked past a clinic where women sat in plastic chairs, their hands clasped over bellies, their faces stern with bravery. Mosquitoes do not respect effort, but that did not stop people from trying. Windows screened, water buckets emptied, neighborhoods turning into small armies armed with larvicide and patience. I listened to a doctor explain risks with a voice trained to carry both truth and gentleness. Outside, families braided hope into action and action into community. I learned something then about how love moves in advance of danger, as if to lay cushions where life might fall. From Brazil, the air thinned and cooled, the sun flattening into a long ribbon of gold as it slid toward a horizon that looked like the lip of a giant bowl. I found myself again in a corridor, but this one had no iron lungs, no humming machines, no neon lights. It had windows open to an autumn field and the faint perfume of apples stored in a bin at the far end. Measles was visiting here, an old enemy returning like a story some had mistaken for a myth. I watched a nurse draw a perfect circle of red, pinned on a chart where the word preventable appeared too many times to ignore. Outside, a father taught his son how to stack wood for the winter. Inside, a child's small chest rose and fell with effort that would have been needless with earlier choices. I don't judge when I travel. History has enough judges. I only watch and hope that whoever needs a bridge will find one before the river rises. In every century I cross, there's a point where the map in my hands becomes a mirror. I turn a corner and see my own eyes reflected in a shop window, or a puddle, or the polished brass of a doorknob. And in that reflection, I see the same lesson repeating. We are bound by breath, and so we must be bound by care. Kay traced that lesson again through towns and cities where the 1957 Asian flu had walked, then along avenues where 1968 left its footprints, and then, as if to remind me that the story never pauses for long, the ground shifted, and I was standing once more in a room whose light was not from candles or sunshine, but from screens. It was after the worst of 2020, yet not beyond all of it. Vaccines had begun to arrive, like letters answering a plea, each dose a sentence in a language that said, "Come back to each other." I watched a pharmacist flex a sore shoulder after a day of injections, count cards, restock vials, smile behind a mask that had creased their cheeks into permanent parenthesis. I watched an elderly couple hold hands in a waiting area as if they were at a dance they thought was canceled forever, their eyes shining above their fabric masks, their thumbs tracing small circles of comfort on each other's knuckles. Outside, a line wound around the block, not with impatience, but with a quiet, almost reverent cadence. People had grown used to waiting, and now they waited for something they wanted to remember. Not every story ended with applause. Some ended with photographs on mantels and chairs left respectfully empty at holidays, with names spoken softly at dusk and candles lit when the wind was kind. I visited those rooms, too. I stood at those mantels. I ran my finger along the smooth wood of chairs whose owners had taught their families the shape of a joke, the timing of a recipe, the meaning of a stubborn hope. Grief is an honest country. It does not pretend, but it does hold. And when it releases you back into life, it leaves you stronger at the places where you cracked. I wish I could tell you that by part, for the story changes shape. That pandemics grow tired of us and disappear entirely from the calendar. But history does not make promises. It extends invitations. Each time it asks, what will you carry forward? In 1889, they learned the cost of speed and the craft of neighborly grace. In the polio summers, they learned the power of collective protection sweetened on a cube of sugar, and the quiet heroism of those who invented safety for strangers. In 1957 and 1968, they learned that warnings spoken by scientists are not incantations, but anchors, and that to tie yourself to them is to survive the storm. In the years of Zika, they learned that love listens for the smallest heartbeat and redraws its plans to safeguard it. In the later winters, they learned that prevention is not fear. It is a form of love that acts before it is asked. I end part. For under a lamppost that hums like a well-behaved bee, its light pulling in a circle at my feet, snow begins to fall with theatrical restraint, one flake at a time, as if the sky is considering whether to commit to the scene. Across the street, a window lifts, and someone leans out to clap for a nurse coming off shift. Not the thunder of 2020's balcony ovations, just two hands meeting softly in cold air, a habit that never entirely left. The nurse looks up, surprised, and touches a hand to their chest. In that gesture, I see Athens and Rome, Constantinople and London, Hong Kong and Sao Paulo. Small towns that never make the page and cities whose names become titles. I see the iron lung and the sugar cube, the gauze mask and the glittering syringe, the bedside song and the doorstep soup. The flake on my glove melts into a dot, a tiny circle, the punctuation mark at the end of a long, breathing sentence. Time begins its familiar tug, gentle as a parent waking a sleeping child. I take one last look around and find, as I always do, a reason to keep going. It isn't a number or a graph, not a headline or a monument. It's a face turned toward another face, a hand reaching for another hand, a laugh that risks the cold to be heard. I step into the shimmer, carrying that sound, ready to set it down wherever the next century asks for light. When the light released me this time, it was into a field that smelled of wet grass and wood smoke. The sky was still soft with dawn, the kind of pale light that makes every shadow seem reluctant to leave. There were no walls, no ships, no markets, only rows of tents pitched low against the wind. I knew this shape of life, temporary, fragile, built because permanence had been interrupted. It was a refugee camp on the edge of a conflict I will not name here, because the war was not the only battle being fought. Cholera had entered the camp, like a rumor, quiet at first, then everywhere. It didn't wear the armor of plague or the fever flush of influenza. Its face was a sudden thirst, a draining away of strength, an ache in the stomach that folded people in on themselves. The ground between the tents was soft with mud from recent rain. Lines formed at the water station where aid workers explained over and over, boil if you can, clean if you can, filter if you can. The if you can hung in the air like smoke. I followed a young boy carrying a jerrycan nearly as tall as his knees. He walked as though each step were a contract, his jaw set, the water sloshing gently at his side. When he reached his tent, he poured carefully into smaller containers, one for each family nearby, no more, no less. It struck me then that sometimes heroism is not a single act, but 1,000 repetitions of a simple kindness. At night, the camp was quieter than any city, but not silent. I could hear the low sounds of those in pain, the soft words of comfort. In many languages, the shuffle of a nurse's boots on the damp ground. Somewhere, A baby cried, the small, sharp proof that even here, life insisted on arriving. The shimmer came without warning, lifting me out of the mud into the dry, bright air of another place entirely. I stood in the middle of a bustling square, paved in sun-bleached stone. The year was 1720, and the air of Marseille carried both the salt of the harbor and the sourness of fear. The great plague of Marseille had begun. One of the last major outbreaks of bubonic plague in Western Europe. Ships sat at anchor, their sails furled, their crews forbidden to disembark, but it was too late. The plague had already found its way into the city. I walked the narrow streets where laundry lines hung limp above heads bowed under the weight of worry. Wooden barriers sealed off entire districts. Guards stood watch, not to keep people out, but to keep them in. Yet, even in a city where death carts rolled daily, I found moments of insistence on the ordinary. A woman sweeping her doorstep, a baker kneading bread as if the world depended on it, a child tracing shapes in the dust with a stick. I realized then that routine can be a rebellion, a way of telling fear, you will not have everything. From Marseille, time carried me inland, to a valley in South America where the mountains were sharp against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. I had come to see a sickness not spread by breath or water, but by a bite. Rabies had taken hold in the stray dog population, and fear spread faster than the virus itself. Kai walked with a veterinarian who moved from village to village, vaccinating dogs with one hand and calming anxious owners with the other. In his satchel, the clink of vials was like the sound of coins, a different kind of treasure, one that could buy life instead of goods. Here, I learned that pandemics do not always roar across the world. Some move in smaller arcs, but their circles can still close tight around a community until breathing feels like a risk. And still, people met the risk head-on, building fences, organizing patrols, teaching children not to run toward a wagging tail. I saw how prevention, though quieter than cure, can hold just as much courage. The shimmer's pool returned, and I stepped into the damp cool of a coastal city in the early 19th century. It was New Orleans during a yellow fever summer. The air hung heavy, and every movement felt slowed, as though the heat itself was an illness. The mosquito, unseen and unnamed as the culprit, flitted freely through open shutters and oversleeping forms. I walked through shaded courtyards where the smell of gardenia could not disguise the scent of sickness. Here, death did not come in weeks or months, but often in days. Funerals became as common as weddings once were. Yet, the same carriages that carried the dead also carried the living toward moments of joy. A child's birthday, a gathering for music, a shared meal. It struck me how people can hold grief in one hand and joy in the other without dropping either, standing there, the cicadas buzzing loud enough to rattle the air. One knew Part 5 was not only about the sicknesses themselves, but about this strange duality, the way life insists on blooming in the cracks. Even when the cracks are carved by fear. The shimmer came once more, and I let it take me, ready for wherever the next page of this long story would open. When the shimmer settled again, I was standing in a small port town on the east coast of Africa. The air was a mingling of salt, tar, and the faint, warm smell of spices that had traveled far by sea. The year was late in the 19th century, and whispers of plague had begun to coil through the alleys like smoke from a slow-burning fire. It had arrived, as it often did, in the quiet dark of a ship's hold. A single rat carrying the unseen riders in its blood, fleas as small as a speck of ash, but carrying death in their bite. It was the third pandemic, a wave that had begun in Asia and would reach far beyond, touching India, Australia, and even the great cities of the Western world. Here, in this port, the sickness had not yet taken many lives, but the fear had already reshaped the streets. Merchants set their goods on tables in the open air, hoping the wind would carry away danger. People crossed the road to avoid passing too close to a cough, yet the harbor was still busy, sails moving like pale wings in the sunlight, and the calls of sailors mixing with the cries of market sellers. I realized then how often pandemics arrive in the middle of life's ordinary business, interrupting but never entirely replacing it. From there, time bent and placed me in a quieter, colder setting, a remote village in the far north, the ground hard with frost even in late spring. Here, the threat was not plague or cholera, but a sudden outbreak of diphtheria. It began with sore throats, but soon the airwaves of the sick swelled and narrowed, their breathing turning into a desperate rasp. Supplies were far away, and winter had not yet loosened its grip on the roads. I watched as a team of sled dogs was harnessed, the lead dog shaking with readiness. They would carry serum across miles of frozen wilderness, the kind of journey that would be spoken of for generations. The riders did not speak much. The cold stole words quickly, but their eyes said everything, the understanding that every hour counted, that a child's next breath could depend on a stranger's endurance. When they returned, frost clung to their eyelashes like tiny stars, and behind them, in the clinic, life began to loosen its hold on death. The shimmer took me again, and I stepped into a city glowing under gas lamps, its streets alive with the rustle of silk skirts and the ring of carriage wheels on cobblestone. It was 1832, and cholera had reached Paris. The sickness moved quickly, leaving the healthy collapsed in hours. Panic turned the city inward. The cafes emptied, the theaters darkened. Yet, in certain corners, the music still played softly, a violin in a shuttered apartment, its notes falling out of an open window like secret messages to anyone who cared to listen. In a small bakery, I saw a boy kneading dough beside his mother. The bread was not for sale. The streets were too empty for business, but for the neighbors, they knew, were too weak to cook. They left loaves at doors in the early hours before the sun rose and the sickness claimed its first victims of the day. It reminded me of a truth I had seen across centuries. When the public face of a city closes, the private hands of its people often open wider. From Paris, I was pulled into a place without the bustle of markets or the roll of ships, an isolated island used as a quarantine station. The buildings were simple, painted white against the deep blue of the surrounding sea. Ships arriving from foreign ports anchored offshore, their passengers ferried here for observation before they could enter the mainland. Some complained about the delay. Others were simply grateful to have reached land at all. I walked the sandy paths between the wooden barracks, watching the way strangers became a kind of temporary family in confinement. Meals were shared at long tables, stories swapped under the sound of the waves. They waited together, not knowing if they carried illness or only the memory of it. Quarantine, I realized, was not just an act of separation, but of suspended time, a pause between fear and freedom. The shimmer came one last time that day. I found myself in a modern city at night, the skyline lit like a constellation made by human hands. This was after the worst of a recent pandemic had passed, though the habit of caution still lingered. People walked in pairs, in groups, in families, their laughter a little tentative, like someone speaking again after a long silence. In a small park, a group had gathered around a table set with candles and tea. They spoke softly, but every so often, one of them would lean back and laugh, and the others would join, their voices rising above the hum of the street. It was the same sound I had been chasing since Athens, the proof that the world, no matter how many times it pauses, always finds a way to resume its song. I stayed until the candles burned low, then stepped back into the shimmer, carrying the memory of those voices with me, ready for wherever the next chapter would open. The shimmer placed me in the middle of a dusty plain, where the horizon seemed to stretch without end, broken only by the thin silhouettes of acacia trees. The air shimmered in the heat, and somewhere far off I could hear the faint, metallic clang of a bell. It was a cattle bell, I realized, carried on the neck of an animal wandering back toward a village where people had begun to fall ill. This was the mid-20th century, and I was in the middle of an outbreak of Rift Valley fever. It was a sickness that didn't arrive with the crashing drama of plague or the swift march of cholera, but with a quieter, insidious pattern. At first, it was the animals, cattle, and sheep falling sick. Then the people who worked with them began to feel the fevers, the aches, the weakness that crept through the body like slow-moving fire. The disease was carried by mosquitoes, born from rains that had filled shallow pools across the plain. I followed a health worker who traveled from hut to hut, explaining in the local language how to cover water, how to rest, how to keep distance from the sick animals. He carried a small box of supplies on his back, not enough for everyone, but more than nothing. In each home, he was greeted with a mixture of relief and worry. I watched as he knelt by a boy lying on a woven mat, his hand resting gently on the child's shoulder while he explained to the mother what signs to watch for in the night. The shimmer came again, carrying me northward across deserts and centuries to the ancient city of Alexandria. It was the 3rd century, and the air smelled of the sea and the sweet rot of fruit left too long in the sun. Here, the plague of Cyprian was unfolding, a disease whose exact nature historians would still debate, but whose presence then was as real and feared as fire in a crowded street. It came in waves, filling the streets with the sound of carts carrying the dead to burial grounds outside the city walls. Inside, the markets thinned, temples fell quieter, and homes turned inward. But here, in the midst of it, I saw something I had not seen in other places. Groups of people tending to the sick, even when they themselves were well, afraid of touching the fevered or closing the eyes of the dead. They were followers of the Christian bishop Cyprian, whose teachings called them to serve even at risk to themselves. Some survived, some did not, but their actions left a trace in the memory of the city, a reminder that courage and compassion can take root even in the soil of fear. From Alexandria, the shimmer pulled me into a place that felt colder in spirit than in temperature, a prison in the late 19th century where tuberculosis moved like a ghost between the cells. The windows were small, the air stale, the walls damp. Men lay on cots, coughing into thin blankets, their voices hoarse from both illness and disuse. The disease here had no swift cruelty, lingered, stealing strength slowly, turning the days into long, aching mirrors of each other. Yet, even in this place, I saw small rebellions against despair. One prisoner, his hands thin and bones sharp beneath the skin, used scraps of paper to make small origami birds, leaving them on the windowsill for the next shift of guards to find. Another shared what little bread he had with a cellmate too weak to stand in line for his ration. They could not open the doors, but they could open themselves to each other. And somehow that seemed a kind of freedom. The shimmer came, gentler this time, as though giving me space to breathe between centuries. I landed in a village in the Pacific Islands, the air warm and thick with the scent of breadfruit trees. It was the early 20th century, and measles had arrived by ship, carried in the lungs of traders who had no idea they were delivering more than goods. For the islanders, who had little immunity to the disease, the results were devastating. Entire families fell sick at once. Villages went quiet, except for the cries of children and a soft chanting of elders praying for the sickness to pass. And yet, in the stillness, there was also care. Canoes ferried food between villages under quarantine. Women sat in the shade weaving mats for those too weak to rise from the floor. A group of young men built fires at the water's edge each night, sending smoke into the air in the hope it would carry the sickness away. I knew it would not, but I also knew that hope, even when it fails as a cure, succeeds as a reason to keep moving through the days. I stayed until the fires burned low, and then the shimmer came again, carrying me onward to whatever page of this long, unfinished story would open next. The shimmer lifted me from the island heat and set me down in the chill air of Kauai, New York City, in 1916. The streets were loud with the clatter of streetcars, the hiss of steam vents, and the voices of children playing stickball in narrow lanes. But the game stopped abruptly when a mother leaned out a window and called her son inside. Word had been spreading. Polio was here. The fear this time was not of a fever that ended in death, but of what could be left behind in survival. The twisted limbs, the muscles that no longer obeyed, the long hospital stays in wards filled with iron lungs. I walked past a school whose doors were locked tight. A notice posted warning parents to keep children away from crowded places. Pools closed, playgrounds emptied, and summer itself seemed to hold its breath. Inside a hospital ward, I saw nurses moving between rows of beds, adjusting braces, massaging legs, speaking gently to children who stared at the ceiling with quiet resignation. Some would walk again, some would not. In the corner, a volunteer sat with a small girl, showing her how to write her name with a pencil gripped awkwardly in her left hand because the right was too weak. The child's brow furrowed in concentration. Okay. But when the last letter was finished, she smiled as if she had just crossed a finish line no one else could see. The shimmer came again, pulling me across continents to the vast, windswept plains of Manchuria in 1910. The snow here was deep, the cold so sharp it seemed to crack the air. The sickness was pneumonic plague, faster, deadlier than the bubonic kind. It spread not through bites, but through breath, moving from person to person like a silent wind. I walked through a makeshift hospital built from timber and canvas. The air inside heavy with the smell of smoke and sickness. Doctors worked in thick, padded coats, their faces hidden behind improvised masks. They burned the bedding and clothing of the dead, trying to halt the spread. Outside, pyres flickered against the endless snow, a grim but necessary measure in a place where the ground was too frozen to dig. One doctor, Ulinde, stood apart, his eyes scanning the camp with a mixture of focus and fatigue. Ha designed a new kind of mask, layering gauze and cotton to better protect against the disease. I watched as he showed others how to wear it, tightening the ties at the back of their heads, making sure no gap remained. It struck me that sometimes the smallest barrier, a mask, a scrap of cloth, can become the thin wall between life and death. The shimmer pulled me again, this time into the soft, buzzing heat of sub-Saharan Africa in the present day. The battle was against malaria, an old enemy that still returned each rainy season. I stood in a small clinic where nets hung from the rafters like translucent sails. Mothers arrived with children on their hips, waiting for the small glass bottles of medicine, the packets of tablets, the folded bed nets that could turn a night's sleep into a shield. Outside, health workers moved from house to house, dipping test strips into small drops of blood, marking doors with chalk to show who had been treated. The air was alive with the hum of insects, but also with the steady rhythm of human persistence. Malaria had been here for centuries, but so had those who refused to let it win without a fight. From the warm clinic air, I was pulled into the brittle chill of a European winter in 1886. This was the year of a scarlet fever outbreak in a small industrial town. The sickness painted cheeks with a deceptive flush, left tongues bright red, and stole the energy from even the liveliest children. Parents sat up at night beside small beds, sponging foreheads, whispering lullabies into rooms that smelled faintly of camphor and boiled milk. A teacher, her own class reduced to half its size, walked the streets delivering lessons on folded sheets of paper to her students' homes. She never entered, only knocked, left the papers, and stepped back. And in the evenings, she lit a candle in her window, a signal to the town that she was still well, still working, still thinking of the children who are not at their desks. Shimmer came once more, but slower this time, as though it, too, wanted me to rest after so many crossings. It placed me in a place I could not name, a quiet field at dusk, the sky painted in streaks of violet and gold. There were no tents, no markets, no wards, only rows of empty chairs, each with a single object on its seat, a loaf of bread, a child's shoe, a folded coat, a string of beads. I understood without being told. These were the absences left behind, the marks pandemics always make. But as I stood there, a breeze moved through, carrying the scent of cooking fires, the far-off hum of conversation, the faint sound of a song. Life was already moving back in, as it always did. The chairs would not remain empty forever. The shimmer brought me into a place where the ground crunched underfoot, brittle with frost, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. I could hear the slow creak of a mill wheel turning. In the distance, water lapping in a narrow channel. The year was somewhere in the early 18th century, in a small European village that had already learned how quickly illness could undo the threads of daily life. This time, it was typhus. It came with fever, rash, and a delirium that made the sick mutter to unseen visitors. In the cold months, it moved faster, passed along in the cramped spaces where people slept close for warmth. I stepped into a low, timbered house where a grandmother sat by the bed of her grandson, pressing a cloth to his forehead. Her own skin was flushed, but she did not move away. In the corner, a loaf of bread cooled on the table. She had baked it, not for herself, but for a neighbor who had also fallen ill. In places like this, care was not an act of heroism. It was as natural as breathing. The shimmer pulled me next, into the glare of a harsh summer sun. I was in 1900, in the city of San Francisco. Just as the plague had arrived again, the same bubonic strain that had traveled the world in earlier centuries. Here, it had found its way into the crowded alleys of Chinatown. The smell of the sea mixed with cooking oil and the dust of unpaved streets. Health officials, unsure of how to act without stirring fear, hesitated, and in that hesitation, the sickness spread quietly. I walked through markets where the usual bustle was thinned, where the clatter of cleavers against chopping blocks was muffled by the sound of hushed conversations. Rumors moved faster than the sickness itself, about who was sick, about where it had come from, about whether it was even real. The truth was written not in words, but in the shuttered windows of certain homes, the ones where no one had been seen in days from the cramped streets of San Francisco. I was carried to the wide, white stillness of an Antarctic research station in the modern day. There were no centuries-old cobblestones here, no crowded markets, only metal corridors, humming heaters, and the constant wind pressing against the walls. A small outbreak of a respiratory illness had arrived, and though it was mild compared to the plagues of history, its impact was magnified by the isolation. There was nowhere to go, no way to bring in reinforcements quickly. I watched as the station's crew reorganized their routines, meals staggered, shared tools wiped after each use, sick quarters set aside. In the evenings, they gathered by video link to families thousands of miles away, the screens glowing in the dim room like small, warm portals to another world. Here, I saw how, even in the farthest reaches of the earth, the same patterns appeared: caution, adaptation, care. The shimmer turned again, this time pulling me into a humid, rain-slick street in an unnamed city in the mid-20th century. Dengue fever had arrived with the rains, carried in the restless wings of mosquitoes that thrived in the standing water pooling in gutters and potholes. It was called breakbone fever for the way it made the joints ache, and though it was rarely fatal, it drained the strength from entire neighborhoods, I walked past open doorways where people lay under thin blankets, their eyes glazed with fever. Neighbors fanned one another with woven palm fronds, boiled herbs into bitter teas, and set bowls of cool water beside the sick. Children were kept indoors, their laughter muffled behind shuttered windows. Yet, when the rains finally eased and the fever's grip loosened, the streets filled again, as if joy had been waiting just out of sight for its cue to return. The shimmer came once more, softer now, as if it knew I was gathering more than simply stories. I was gathering the pulse of humanity through centuries of trial. It placed me in a place I could not place on any map, where every face I had ever seen in these journeys seemed to pass by, each carrying something small, a loaf of bread, a vial of medicine, a hand extended toward another. And I understood that Part 7 was not just another page in this long chronicle. It was the middle of the thread, the place where you can look back and see the path already traveled, can forward to the path still waiting, both lit by the same quiet flame. The shimmer opened into the smell of salt and sun-warmed stone. I was standing on a narrow quay in the Mediterranean, the sea a bright sheet rippling against moored fishing boats. The year was 1817, and beyond these bright waters, the world's first recognized cholera pandemic had begun its long, relentless spread. It had started far from here, in the Ganges Delta, but trade and troop movements carried it outward in widening circles. The town seemed ordinary at first glance, fishermen mending nets, women washing clothes at the water's edge. Yet there was a tautness beneath the scene, like a rope drawn too tight. The well in the center of the square, once a place for gossip and laughter, now carried a shadow of doubt. People still drew water, but they looked away from one another as they filled their buckets, their eyes darting toward the horizon as if distance could explain the danger. I followed a small boy carrying 2 brimming pails toward a low, whitewashed house. Inside, a woman lay on a mat, her breathing shallow, her lips dry. The boy set the pails down and sat beside her, pressing her hand between his own. The water he carried might help, or it might carry the same invisible danger that had brought her low, but it was all he had. In that moment, I realized that love rarely waits for certainty. It acts with what it has. The shimmer drew me onward, setting me down in the early 21st century in a desert city where the air shimmered with heat rising from concrete. The MERS coronavirus was here, slow-moving compared to some outbreaks, but frightening for its severity. Its hospitals were on alert, wards divided, protective masks in use. I walked through an intensive care unit where the steady beeping of monitors was the only sound. A doctor adjusted a ventilator settings with the same care someone might give to a sleeping child. In a nearby room, a patient's family member pressed their palm to the glass, their face hidden by a mask, their body leaning toward the one they could not touch. From there, I was carried backward into the 19th century again, this time to a steamy port in the Caribbean. Yellow fever was in the air, carried by mosquitoes no one had yet identified as the culprits. Ships brought sugar, rum, and also the seeds of illness. I walked through streets where shutters were closed against the day, not to keep out heat, but to keep out death. The fever struck hardest at the newcomers, sparing those who had survived it before, a cruel sort of immunity purchased only with suffering at the edge of town. I found a small chapel. Inside, a priest knelt beside a man too weak to sit up, murmuring prayers while a breeze moved through the open doorway. The light fell across the man's face, and for a moment, the sickness seemed far away. That is the other thing I have learned in these travels. Even in the center of fear, the world still gives moments of beauty, as if to remind the living what they are fighting to keep. The shimmer pulled me into a colder place, a mining camp in the mountains of the American West, late in the 19th century. The men here worked deep underground, breathing dust and sharing close quarters. When influenza came, it moved quickly. The camp's doctor treated them with what little he had: rest, broth, mustard, plasters. I watched as a fellow miner sat by his friend's bed through the night, telling stories about their childhood in another country, his voice soft in the dark, as if the telling itself could keep his friend tethered to the world. From the cramped miner's cabin, the shimmer lifted me once more, but this time it set me down in a place I knew I would not want to leave quickly. A vast open field under a night sky so clear the stars seemed close enough to touch. I was in a modern refugee settlement in the Middle East, where the conflict outside the camp's borders was matched by the arrival of a measles outbreak inside. Aid workers moved through the rows of tents with clipboards and small coolers holding vaccine doses. Children lined up, their faces a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Some cried, some laughed nervously, some held hands with siblings. She received a small bandage on the upper arm, a tiny badge of protection. The work was slow, but it moved forward, one tent, one child, one family at a time. The air was full of dust and determination. The shimmer began to gather again, the edges of the world bending toward light. It lifted me away. I realized that in every century, every climate, every culture, the same truth had held. The sickness comes, the fear grows, but people find each other. They hold hands through the cloth of a protective suit. They bring water even when they are unsure it is safe. They kneel by a bed and speak softly into the fevered dark. And so, Part 8 closed not with the image of a disease, tearing, but with the sight of someone carrying a small flame through the night, enough light to see the next step, enough warmth to remind those nearby they are not alone. The shimmer opened into damp air, thick with the smell of earth and green things. I was standing at the edge of a jungle river, its surface broken by drifting leaves and the occasional ripple of something unseen beneath. It was the 21st century, deep in the Amazon basin, and I had arrived in the middle of a malaria season. Here, sickness moved with the same patience as the river, slow at first, then suddenly swift when the rains came heavy and long. Communities timed their lives around it, knowing when to fish, when to plant, and when to guard themselves against the hum of the night. I followed a health worker upriver in a narrow boat, the engine coughing as it pushed against the current. She carried boxes of bed nets, test kits, and packets of medicine, her voice calm as she explained the cycle of the mosquito, the importance of nets tucked in tight. We stopped at a small settlement where children ran to meet the boat, bare feet scattering the dust. In one home, a mother sat beside her daughter, fanning her with a palm leaf, the girl's eyes heavy-lidded with fever. Outside, men strung nets over the beds, each knot tied with the quiet urgency of habit. The air was heavy, but there was no panic, only the steady rhythm of people doing what they knew must be done. The shimmer came again, pulling me across the ocean and back in time to 17th century London. The smell hit before the sound, the sour temps of sickness undercut by the sharper scent of burning pitch, which the city believed might purify the air. It was another wave of plague, one of the many that had returned since the Black Death. I walked through narrow lanes where red crosses were painted on the doors of infected houses. The words, "Lord, have mercy upon us," written above. Some streets were empty, others still alive with the movements of those who had not yet been touched by the sickness. A watchman stood at a corner, barring entry to a quarantined alley. Inside one of the marked houses, a man sat at a window, looking out as if the sight of the street might be his last piece of the world. But I also saw small rebellions against despair, a neighbor lowering a basket of bread by rope to the family. Inside, children leaning out of upper windows to exchange jokes across the narrow gap. A cat slipping between houses as if no walls could hold it. From the shadowed lanes of London, Shimmer took me to the mid-20th century, to a city whose air was sharp with winter and cold smoke. I was in Copenhagen during a polio outbreak in 1952, one of the worst in history. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Iron lungs filled every available space, and doctors turned to new, desperate measures to keep patients alive. I walked through a ward where medical students took shifts hand-pumping oxygen into the lungs of the sick, hours upon hours, day and night, their arms aching, their eyes red from exhaustion. In the quiet between pumps, I could hear the sound of breath being given, held, and given again. One young man, his hands cramping from the strain, still managed to smile at the patient in his care, whispering, "We'll keep you breathing. I promise." The shimmer lifted me again, carrying me into the warm light of a Pacific island in the late 19th century. Leprosy, Hansen's disease, had taken hold here, and those diagnosed were sent to live in isolation on a far shore. I walked the sandy paths of this settlement. The sea stretching endlessly to one side, the mountains rising steeply on the other. The people here built homes, planted gardens, and created their own rhythms of life, despite the exile. A man carved small boats from driftwood, placing them in the water for the tide to carry away. Messages, he told me, though he didn't know if they would ever reach anyone. A woman wove mats of pandanus leaves, her fingers quick, her eyes fixed on the pattern. I realized then that sometimes survival is not just about outlasting illness, but about keeping beauty alive in the middle of it. As the shimmer began to gather again, I thought about the span of this journey, from the mosquito nets of the mosquito nets of the mosquito net. Well, because I'm gonna start out by going to Starbucks, but about Spain's, but about keeping beauty alive. Amazon, to the rope baskets of plague London, from the pumping hands in Copenhagen to the carved boats on a distant shore. Every century, every place, different tools, different names, but the same quiet determination. And when the shimmer finally closed around me, carrying me toward the next page, I knew part 9 was ending on the same truth as all the others, that even in the shadow of sickness, people find ways to make the air between them a little warmer. The shimmer released me into warm, dusty air where the horizon shimmered with heat. I was in West Africa, in a village where the red earth clung to the soles of my boots. It was the early 21st century, and I had arrived in the middle of a Lassa fever outbreak. The sickness had crept in quietly, carried not by ships or crowded streets, but by the grain stores, where the droppings of rats carried the invisible seeds of danger. The market was quieter than it should have been for midday. Women sat beside baskets of yams and cassava, their eyes watchful, their movements careful. At the edge of the village, a small clinic stood, walls painted pale blue, the air inside cooler but heavy with the scent of antiseptic. A nurse moved between beds, speaking softly in the local language, her voice low and steady, like the rhythm of a drum in the distance. One bed held a young man whose skin shone with fever. His mother sat beside him, fanning him with a folded piece of cardboard. Every so often she would touch his forehead, her brow furrowing, then smooth the blanket over his chest. Outside, children played with the worn football, their laughter somehow unbroken by the knowledge that sickness had come. I had seen this before, the way life insists on happening alongside fear. The shimmer took me next into the damp, crowded alleys of an early 20th century port city in South Asia. The monsoon rains had only just passed, leaving behind puddles and the rich smell of wet earth. It was here that cholera, still common in the region, would surge after heavy rains. I watched as men pushed carts of clay jars filled with water from distant wells, the villagers lining up with brass pots and tin cups. There was no guarantee the water was safe, but it was all they had. In a shaded courtyard, an older woman stirred a large pot of rice porridge over a charcoal fire. She ladled it into small bowls for the sick. adding a pinch of salt to replace what the fever and illness had stolen from their bodies. In her face, I saw the same expression I'd seen in a mother in Athens, in a baker in Paris, in a nurse in 1918, the quiet, stubborn refusal to let someone slip away without a fight. From the humidity of the port city, the shimmer drew me to the frozen north, to a remote Alaskan village in 1918. The Spanish flu had reached here months after it began in the cities, carried by a small mailboat. The illness moved through the community so quickly that there were not enough healthy people left to care for the sick. I walked past homes with their doors swinging open, snow drifting in. Inside, I found children huddled together under blankets, waiting for parents who would not return. And yet, out of the white silence came movement. Volunteers from neighboring villages arriving by dog-sold, bringing food, blankets, and medicine. They moved from house to house, checking for survivors, carrying the weak to a communal building where the fires were kept burning day and night. In the cold, I saw not just the fragility of life, but the resilience of those who refused to abandon one another. The shimmer carried me again. It's time to a bustling European city in the 14th century, but not to the Black Death itself. This was the period just after one of its great waves had receded. The city was still marked by loss, empty houses, gardens overgrown, streets with more stray dogs than people, but it was also in motion again. Builders repaired bridges, market stalls reopened, and musicians played in the square, their songs carrying a bittersweet joy. I watched as a man stood at the doorway of his shop, polishing the sign above it. The wood gleamed in the sunlight, freshly cleaned, as if to declare that the world was still here, and so was he. The sight reminded me that pandemics end not in a single moment of triumph, but in countless small acts of reopening, reclaiming, and rebuilding. From there, the shimmer began to glow again, pulling me toward whatever century was waiting. As the light closed around me, I thought about how Part 10 had not been about the arrival of pandemics, but about what people do in their middle chapters, how they adapt, how they hold steady, and how they begin to turn back toward the light, even when the shadow still lingers. The shimmer opened onto a narrow, sun-baked road lined with olive trees, their leaves flashing silver in the afternoon wind. I was in southern Italy, sometime in the late 17th century. The summer was dry, the air sharp with the scent of dust and herbs crushed underfoot. It should have been a season of harvest and trade, but there was a weight in the village that went beyond the heat. Smallpox had arrived. I saw it first in the faces of children, flushed and dotted with the telltale rash, their skin tender under the hands of mothers who tried to soothe them. In the village square, a cart stood with its wheels mired in dust, loaded not with produce, but with buckets of cool water and bundles of linens. The priest moved quietly among the houses, offering prayers at doorways where the shutters had been drawn. Inside one such house, a grandmother sat beside her granddaughter, stroking her hair as if to remind the girl she was still loved beneath the sickness. On a small table, a bowl of figs sat untouched, their sweetness meant to tempt an appetite that had fled. I realized then that food offered to the sick is more than sustenance. It is hope shaped into something the hands can hold. The shimmer took me northward to the bustling heart of Vienna in 1831. Here, cholera had made its entrance. Traveling along rivers and trade routes from the east, the elegant avenues were quieter, the cafes half empty. In one of them, a pianist played to a room of only 3 patrons, his fingers moving as if the empty chairs themselves deserved music. Outside, a young man sold vinegar by the bottle, promising it would purify the air. Whether it did or not was beside the point. What people bought from him was the feeling of control in a time when so much felt uncontrollable. From Vienna, I was drawn into the dim interior of a remote monastery high in the mountains. It was the early 20th century, and typhoid fever had swept through the small community of monks. They treated each other with herbs grown in their own gardens, boiled water from the mountain streams, and prayed together in the cold stone chapel. One monk, too weak to stand, sang the responses from his cot, his voice thin but unwavering. It struck me how illness can strip away many things, but devotion to faith, to craft, to one another often remains untouched. The shimmer came again, pulling me into a humid city in Southeast Asia in the late 1800s. Bubonic plague had arrived by sea, hidden in the cargo holds of merchant ships. Whole neighborhoods were sealed off, the wooden gates guarded by men with rifles. I walked the narrow lanes inside, where people hung laundry between shuttered houses, trying to keep some rhythm of life despite the confinement. In one doorway, a woman embroidered a bright red cloth, the needle flashing in the light. It would become a wedding gift, she told me, for a daughter whose celebration had been postponed. The cloth, she said, would wait as long as it needed to. The shimmer's pull returned, but slower now, as if giving me a chance to look back on the scenes I'd carried through this part of the journey. The figs in the quiet house, the pianist playing two empty chairs, the monk singing from his bed, the mother stitching red thread into a promise. Part 11, I realized, was about the way people keep the fabric of life from unraveling, even when they know the world has been altered. When the shimmer finally closed, it felt less like a departure and more like a gentle hand on my back, guiding me forward to the next chapter. The shimmer opened to the sound of bells, not church bells, but the sharp, hollow clang of a buoy in a foggy harbor. The year was 1899, and I stood on the edge of Honolulu's port. The air smelled of salt and coal smoke, but under it lingered something acrid, the scent of burning. The bubonic plague had arrived here, carried, as it so often was, by ships. And the Board of Health had begun a desperate, controversial campaign, setting fire to infected buildings in Chinatown to halt its spread. I walked through streets where people carried their belongings in bundles, faces drawn tight with worry. In the midst of displacement, one woman stopped to arrange a potted plant she had brought with her, placing it in the corner of her temporary shelter. It was a hibiscus, red and alive against the gray ash. I understood. Sometimes you carry beauty forward as proof you still own a piece of the world. From Honolulu, the shimmer drew me to a hot, still summer in New Orleans in 1878. Yellow fever had arrived again, and it was the worst outbreak in the city's history. I walked through neighborhoods where the shutters were closed and the streets were silent except for the occasional rattle of a passing cart. In one house, a man sat fanning his wife while reading aloud from a newspaper, not the grim headlines, but a serialized romance printed at the bottom of the page. His voice was low, steady, carrying her somewhere else for as long as the story allowed. The shimmer carried me onward to the dusty expanse of the Sahel in the late 20th century. Here, meningitis moved silently through villages during the dry season, spreading from one close conversation to the next. I followed a vaccination team, traveling in a battered truck, their cooler boxes strapped down with rope. At each stop, the team was met by long lines under the blazing sun. People waited patiently, their faces serious, children leaning sleepily against their mother's skirts. The nurses' hands moved quickly, each small injection a shield raised against the invisible. From the heat of the Sahel, I was pulled into the cool green of rural Ireland in the mid-1800s. Typhus had taken root here during the Great Famine, traveling easily among those weakened by hunger. I stepped into a one-room cottage where a woman lay under a coarse wool blanket, her breath shallow. Kay neighbor sat by her bed, spooning water between her lips, humming an old tune. Kay said the potato fields lay in ruin, but inside there was still the sound of a human voice, the persistence of care. The shimmer began to gather again, and I thought about how part 12 was made of both fire and water. Its heat and cold, of the hibiscus in the ash. The story read aloud to the fevered, the steady line of those waiting under a harsh sun, the neighbor humming through hunger. The places and centuries changed, but the shape of love remained constant, bending itself to whatever the moment demanded. When the light closed around me, felt the next chapter pulling closer, the long arc beginning to lean toward its end, but still carrying more voices, more rooms, more moments where the flame was kept. The shimmer opened onto a street paved in stone, slick from a recent rain. Gas lamps cast small halos in the fog, and the air carried the faint scent of coal smoke and something sharper, disinfectant. It was London in 1854. During one of its fiercest cholera outbreaks, I found myself standing at the edge of Broad Street, where people spoke in hushed tones about the deaths that had come too quickly to understand. I followed the sound of boots on cobblestones to a pump in the square, its handle worn smooth from countless hands. A physician named John Snow stood nearby, talking quietly to a local official. His gaze was focused, but his voice was gentle, as though persuasion here was an act of care. Not long after, the pump handle would be removed, and with it, the invisible path of the disease would be broken. I stepped into one of the narrow houses lining the street. A woman sat at a table, her head bowed over a cup of tea gone cold, her hands wrapped tightly around it. She was alone now in rooms that had been full only a week earlier, but she still lit a candle each night and placed it in the window for those still walking home. She whispered, though she did not expect anyone to come. The shimmer took me next into the 21st century, into a rural clinic in sub-Saharan Africa, where an Ebola outbreak had drawn both fear and resolve. Aside, the midday sun lay heavy on the ground. Side, the light was dim and filtered through pale curtains, the air cool with the hum of a single ceiling fan. A health worker in full protective gear adjusted the foredrip for a patient who was too weak to lift her head. From across the small ward, another patient called out softly, not in pain, but to thank the worker for bringing water earlier. Quiet gratitude, spoken through a mask of exhaustion, seemed to ripple outward in the room, softening the edges of fear. It reminded me of something I had learned long ago in a plague-struck port. Words can disinfect the air between people as surely as any medicine. From the quiet clinic, I was pulled to a humid afternoon in Rio de Janeiro in the early 20th century. Yellow fever had long haunted the city, but now public health officers were moving through neighborhoods, fumigating houses, draining pools of water, and encouraging residents to open their shutters for air. I followed one officer who paused at every doorway to greet each person, explaining in patient detail why these steps mattered. His work was part science, part trust building, and in that trust, I saw the beginnings of change that would outlast the outbreak. The shimmer turned again, slower now, bringing me to a wind-swept coastal village in northern Japan in the late 1800s. Influenza had come in with a fishing vessel, and it spread rapidly among the families who worked at docks. In a small wooden house, a father sat by the fire, feeding broth to his sick children, one spoonful at a time. The sea outside was restless, the wind battering the walls, but his focus never left the children's faces. As the shimmer began to gather, I realized that part 13 had been about persistence, about the pump handle removed, the candle in the window, the water brought in protective gloves, careful explanations at doorways, the broth spooned in stormlight. Small acts repeated without fanfare till the shadow began to recede. When the light closed around me again, I knew there were only 2 more parts left in this journey, the ending already taking shape like a shoreline just ahead, still blurred by mist. The shimmer released me into air that smelled of damp stone and pine smoke. I was in Eastern Europe in the early 17th century, in a market town surrounded by low hills. The square should have been full of voices, the jangle of harness bells, the smell of bread baking. Instead, the stalls stood half empty, and people moved through the streets with a kind of careful distance, not yet knowing the word quarantine, but obeying its shape. Typhus had arrived with a caravan of traders. The sickness clung to clothing, spread by lice, carried into crowded inns where travelers shared narrow rooms. I stepped into one such inn where the benches were stacked against the wall and the hearth burned low. Upstairs, a young woman lay in bed, her hair damp with fever. Her sister sat beside her, slowly braiding her hair, as if to keep at least one thing neat in a world turning ragged. The shimmer carried me forward to 1919, to a city just beginning to reopen after the Spanish flu. I walked along streets where shopkeepers were dusting shelves and cafe owners set out chairs in the pale sunlight. On a corner, a man sold newspapers with headlines about peace treaties and economic recovery. But beneath them, in smaller print, there were still notices about the flu, the tale of a shadow that had not fully lifted. In a park, I saw two women sitting on a bench, masks still hanging from ribbons around their necks. They spoke in low voices, their hands folded in their laps. One of them laughed suddenly, a short, surprised sound, and for a moment they looked at each other as if the laugh itself was a sign they had stepped back into the world. From there, the shimmer drew me into the warm, dry air of North Africa in the late 19th century. Cholera had swept inland from the port cities, following trade routes through villages and oases. At one way station, a caravan had halted for the night. The camels were tethered in the shade, their packs set aside. Healer moved from person to person, offering sips of water mixed with herbs, her hands stained green from the leaves she had crushed. She did not promise cures, only comfort, only presence. The shimmer pulled again, setting me down in a city I recognized instantly. Though the year was different, the air still carried the same undercurrent of resilience. It was Hong Kong in the late 1990s, during an H5N1 avian flu outbreak. The streets were busy but careful. Poultry markets, once noisy and crowded, were quieter now, their cages partly empty. At the entrance to one, a worker sprayed the soles of visitors' shoes, a small, almost ceremonial act of protection. I followed a woman carrying a basket of vegetables up a flight of stairs to her apartment. Inside, her elderly father sat by the window, a radio on the table beside him. She washed her hands at a basin, then brought him tea, setting it down without a word. He looked at her, smiled faintly, and reached for the cup. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but it was heavy with everything unspoken, the fear, the care, the choice to keep showing up for each other as the shimmer began to form around me again. I knew part 14 had been about the edges of pandemics, the way they start quietly, the way they fade but never entirely vanish, the way life stitches itself back together in both small stitches and larger seams. I carried with me the image of a sister braiding hair, a laugh on a park bench, a healer's green-stained hands, and a father lifting tea to his lips. There was only one part left now, and I could feel it waiting, the closing step of this long walk through the century.